Good morning, you're listening to the brief wake up, your mindful start to the day. I'm Handel, your daily coffee companion, helping you wake up informed, thoughtful, and maybe just a little amused before the day gets old. If you're commuting, corralling kids, or just standing in line for caffeine, you're in the right place. Let's get you caught up. For health this morning, let's talk about doom scrolling. That reflex to keep scrolling bad news, even when it's clearly making us feel worse. This isn't a character flaw, it's biology. Our brains are wired with a negativity bias. We pay more attention to threats than to neutral or positive information. In evolutionary terms, that kept us alive. In a modern news feed that never ends, it keeps us anxious. Algorithms amplify this by prioritizing content that provokes fear, anger, or outrage, because those emotions keep us engaged longer. Neurologically, doom scrolling keeps the stress response turned on. Cortisol stays elevated, sleep quality drops. Over time, this is linked to higher rates of anxiety, depressed mood, irritability, and a sense of helplessness. You're not just consuming information, you're training your nervous system to stay in alert mode. There's also a cognitive cost. When we repeatedly consume large volumes of negative information without the ability to act on it, the brain starts to associate awareness with powerlessness. That combination is uniquely toxic for mental health. So what do you do about it? You can contain your exposure. Don't eliminate news, but instead schedule it. Set a defined window once or twice a day, and when the time is up, stop. This gives your brain a clear on-off signal instead of a constant drip. Also, change the format. Long-form articles, podcasts, or newsletters are less activating than rapid-fire feeds. They provide context, not just adrenaline. Another hack is to pair information with agency. If you read about a problem, balance it with one small, concrete action. Donate, write, discuss, or learn something actionable. Agency reduces anxiety. And finally, replace the scroll. When you feel the urge, substitute something that engages the body or attention. A walk, music, a brief workout, reading fiction, or even boredom. Boredom is not a threat, it's a reset. Bottom line, doom scrolling hijacks a survival system that was never designed for 24-hour catastrophe. Managing it isn't about ignorance, it's about protecting your nervous system so you can stay informed without being overwhelmed. The news is next. In the news, President Trump is heading to Davos, Switzerland, and that matters more than it sounds. Davos is where the World Economic Forum holds its annual meeting. It's not a government body. No laws are passed. No treaties are signed. But once a year, Davos becomes the closest thing the world has to a global strategy room. Presidents, prime ministers, central bankers, CEOs, and tech leaders all gather in one place to compare notes. Publicly on panels, privately inside rooms. Why does that matter? Because markets and governments don't just react to policy, they react to signals. Davos is where direction gets clarified before decisions become official. Trade priorities, investment themes, energy strategy, AI governance, and geopolitical red lines are often sketched out here long before they show up in legislation or markets. This year's meeting is especially consequential, and Trump's presence amplifies that. First, trade and tariffs. With global supply chains still fragile and inflation lingering, leaders are listening for any signal about how aggressively the US may pursue tariffs or industrial policy. Even a shift in tone can ripple through markets. Second, geopolitics. Ongoing conflicts, rising defense spending, and strained alliances mean Davos is being used as a pressure gauge. Allies want reassurance. Competitors want clarity. Everyone wants to know how transactional the next phase of US leadership will be. And third, the ideological contrast. Davos has long symbolized globalization and multilateral cooperation. Trump represents a different worldview, nationalist and deal-driven, skeptical of global institutions. That collision makes this year's conversations sharper and more revealing. Bottom line, Davos isn't about headlines, it's about alignment. And when a US president walks into that room, the world listens closely, because what's signaled in Davos often shapes the year ahead. Tech and culture is next. Today we are talking about trade, and one of the simplest economic ideas that also happens to be one of the hardest to understand intuitively. It's called comparative advantage, and this sits at the intersection of economics, systems design, and geopolitics. So we're putting it in tech and culture. On paper, it's straightforward. In real life, it feels wrong because it conflicts with how we think about skill, fairness, and strength. Here's the sentence that trips people up. Everyone is better off when each side focuses on doing what costs them the least to do, even if one side is better at everything. The reason that sounds wrong is because we instinctively ask the wrong question. We ask, who's better? Comparative advantage asks, what's being wasted? And once you see that difference, everything else clicks. So let's leave economics and go somewhere concrete. An operating room. A surgeon can clean the OR. They can mop the floor. They can wipe down surfaces. They might even do it better than most people. So why don't they? Not because they can't, but because of what it costs them. Every minute a surgeon spends cleaning is a minute they're not operating. And operating is the highest value use of their time. That's the embedded rule right there. The question isn't who can do the job. It's who should, given what they'd have to give up. Now look at the other side. The person who cleans the OR may not be able to operate, but they can clean efficiently, repeatedly, and at scale. So, a simple trade forms. The cleaner specializes in cleaning. The surgeon specializes in surgery. Both are better off. More patients are treated. The room stays sterile. That's comparative advantage. Here's where people still get stuck. They say, but what if the surgeon is better at both surgery and cleaning? It doesn't matter. Time is scarce. Comparative advantage isn't about who's best. It's about who gives up the least by doing the task. The surgeon gives up enormous value by cleaning. The cleaner gives up very little. Specialization avoids waste. Now zoom out from the operating room to the world. Countries work the same way. Some countries specialize in advanced technology, high-skill services, or capital-intensive manufacturing. Others specialize in large-scale production, assembly, or supply chain coordination. Even if one country is technically better at many things, it still shouldn't do everything, because doing so pulls resources away from where they create the most value. That's why trade is not charity, it's not weakness, it's mutual efficiency. This is also why tariffs feel intuitive, but often backfire. Tariffs force countries to do work they're relatively worse at. It's like telling the surgeon, clean your own OR to protect cleaning jobs. You might save a position on paper, but the system slows down. Fewer surgeries get done. Costs go up everywhere else. Tariffs don't destroy comparative advantage. They override it, and the price shows up as higher costs, slower growth, and less innovation. So, here's the real takeaway. Comparative advantage isn't about being weaker. It's about not wasting your strongest asset. Surgeons don't clean the OR not because they're incapable, but because the system collapses when everyone tries to do everything themselves. Global trade works the same way. The lighter roast is next. Why this date feels like it costs more than it should have. Have you noticed that going out to dinner now feels heavier than it used to? Not emotionally heavy, financially heavy. Like you didn't just go on a date, you made a small capital allocation decision. You sit down, you order 2 drinks, an appetizer you didn't need, but socially felt correct. Everything feels normal until the bill arrives. And there's that pause. Not because the bill is wrong, but because it feels out of proportion to the experience. And here's the part that messes with your head. Most restaurants still aren't actually making much money. That's the disconnect. We're paying more, but it doesn't feel like anyone's winning. Here's what's really happening. When you drop a few $100s on dinner, your brain assumes someone is doing great here. But almost none of that money sticks. A big chunk goes to food and alcohol, ingredients, spoilage, and waste. Another huge chunk goes to labor, cooks, servers, dishwashers, managers, and payroll taxes. Then rent, insurance, utilities, and costs that exist whether the place is packed or empty. By the time all of that's paid, what's left isn't a windfall. It's $20 or $30. That's not profit that changes your life. That's profit that keeps the lights on. So why does the bill still feel so bad? Because dinner used to feel casual, and now it feels like an event. Not because the food doubled in quality, but because every hidden cost in the system finally showed up on the menu. And this feeling, that quiet wince when the check hits, is actually a kind of economic barometer. Restaurants sit right at the intersection of food prices, wages, rent, energy, and consumer confidence. When dinner starts to feel expensive emotionally, it's often because all of those pressures are converging at once. Nothing dramatic happened at your table. Inflation just finished its journey. So what we're reacting to isn't greed, it's visibility. We're not angry that dinner costs more. We're unsettled that something ordinary quietly crossed into special occasion territory without asking us first. And that's why the date doesn't feel overpriced. It just feels off. Or, as the kids would say, kind of ick. Our commemoration is next. January 21st is one of those dates where history quietly clusters around power, ideas, and the systems we build to carry them forward. On this day in 1793, Louis XVI was executed during the French Revolution. It wasn't just the death of a king, it was the collapse of monarchy as a governing assumption. One of the first moments when a modern society decided that legitimacy came not from bloodline, but from the people and enforced brutally by the state itself. More than a century later, on January 21st, 1924, Vladimir Lenin died. What followed is a reminder that leaders pass, but systems don't disappear with them. Lenin's death didn't end Soviet power. It hardened it. Institutions once built tend to outlive the people who create them. That tension between power and narrative shows up again on this date. On January 21st, 1950, George Orwell died. Orwell spent his life warning that control doesn't just come through force, it comes through language. Who defines truth? Who names reality? Who controls the story people tell themselves about what's happening? And then there's January 21st, 1976, when Concorde entered commercial service. One of the most ambitious technological projects of the 20th century. Supersonic travel, faster than the rotation of the Earth. And a reminder that the future isn't just about what's possible, it's about what's sustainable. Concorde worked, the economics didn't. Taken together, these moments trace a pattern. Power challenged, ideology hardened, language weaponized, and technology raced ahead of cost. And then, almost quietly, we land on something else. Today is also National Hugging Day, which sounds light until you realize why it exists. It exists because someone noticed we weren't doing enough of it. After all the systems, revolutions, ideologies, and machines, we still needed a reminder to stop, reach out, and connect. That contrast might be the real commemoration of January 21st, a reminder that history is shaped by power and ideas, but endured by human beings. Today's show moved from the inside of the nervous system to the architecture of the global economy. We looked at how doom-scrolling keeps our stress response permanently activated, how Davos quietly shapes global direction through signals rather than laws, and why comparative advantage explains everything from operating rooms to trade wars. The through line is the same. Systems work best when attention, labor, and power are used deliberately, not reactively. This is Dr. Robinson for the Brief Wake Up. Stay calm, kind, and curious. I'll catch up with you tomorrow.